Number 8. K-27. The Russian authorities are investigating whether a sunken Soviet nuclear-powered submarine, the K-27, can be safely raised so that crews can remove the uranium in its reactors. In 1968, at the height of the Cold War, the K-27 met with disaster when radiation leaked from one of its reactors during an excursion in the Arctic. While to some people it makes sense to use a nuclear power source for military submarines, to others it makes little sense from an environmental one. A good, or should we say a bad example of this was the K-27, an old Soviet attack sub from the 1960s. It was just over 360 feet long and weighed 4,380 tons below the surface. Factor in a traveling speed of 30.2 knots, and this is one big hunk of metal you wouldn't want to run into under the sea. The sub was powered by two VT-1 reactors, which the Soviets described as experimental. Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, actually, it wasn't. It was probably a red-hot ticking time bomb. A liquid metal coolant played a significant role in the operation of these reactors. Can you believe this vessel was sent out with a crew who reportedly hadn't received any extensive training? This appears to have been an accident waiting to happen, and sure enough, it did. Radioactive gas leaked into the sub, resulting in the deaths of 9 crew members from radiation exposure. The K-27 made it back to base, but by the early 1980s it was clear to the Russians that serious measures needed to be taken. The Soviets sealed off the reactor compartments and scuttled it into the Kara Sea in a move that would shock environmentalists everywhere. Scuttling is where a seagoing vessel is deliberately sunk by its owners. This happened at a depth of only 108 feet, reportedly way too shallow for that kind of dangerous material. Last we heard, the K-27 would be removed from its watery grave because of a new Russian government initiative. Here's hoping that happens sooner rather than later. You don't want a bunch of radioactive material just sitting in the water, sealed away or not. Number 7. U-864. World War II may be yesterday's news, but it's important to remember that the fallout from that conflict is still felt by people today. In the Norwegian Sea, there's an island in an area known as Vestland County. In 2003, they received a nasty surprise after discovering that a Nazi-era submarine had sunk in the water decades earlier. The really nasty part was its cargo. Among its goodies were Japanese airplane components and nearly 2,000 barrels of mercury for military use. Unfortunately, that mercury had apparently been leaking out and contaminating the local sea life. Not something you want to think about when biting into a crab salad, right? The U-864 was launched in 1943 and met its end because of a British torpedo attack less than a couple of years later. This was during part of Operation Caesar, an effort to transport deadly materials to their allies. The sub was just over 287 feet long and weighed 1,799 tons once underwater. It moved at a speed of almost 7 knots in action. There were 73 German crew members aboard who lost their lives. The British sub HMS Venturer carried out the attack, which is thought to be the first below-the-surface face-off in history. In the 21st century, with the grim discovery came a major debate on how to handle this truly toxic situation. The U-864 lies 499 feet down, and eventually a decision was made by authorities to bury the sub in sand underwater. This was supposed to have happened by 2020. However, it didn't appear to have taken place. According to environmentalists, the move is a controversial one who insist that mercury will continue to leak anyway, continuing to threaten marine life in the vicinity. It seems whatever people do, contamination will occur in the local ecosystem. Even the act of moving what are now very rusty barrels brings challenges. We don't envy their situation and wish them luck in resolving the dilemma as quickly as possible. What do you think is the best disposal method for nuclear waste? Number 6. K-219. In 1986, a Soviet submarine sank off the coast of Bermuda. It was an alarming enough situation, but one made even more frightening because it carried nukes. The K-219 is described as a second-generation vessel and has been used for this purpose since 1971. Measuring 425 feet long and 38 feet wide, it had a top speed of 26 knots. According to reports, the ballistic missiles were R-27s, and the sub carried no less than 16 of them at the time it went down, according to reports. So why did it go down? One of the K-219's missile tubes developed a leak and started taking on seawater. Not a good thing because despite subs being in seawater all the time, there are elements such as fuel inside the tubes that can create devastating reactions if exposed to it. Add an electrical charge and you have a recipe for an explosion. The crew reportedly wasn't organized enough to access or deal with the problem. It was possible to empty the missile tube using a pump, but that short-circuited and sparked, resulting in a big bang. After 3 days of trying to rescue the sub, it had to be abandoned. The captain and his men made it out, though sadly 3 crew members lost their lives. At one point, an attempt was made to tow the K-219, but the line snapped. There were a lot of international intrigues. While the United States was concerned about the Soviet crew members' safety and understood the critical situation, old tensions remained. The Russians had lost a nuclear submarine and their enemies might access this. A movie about the real-life drama starring Martin Sheen titled Hostile Waters was released a decade or so later. The K-219 is currently 18,000 feet down in an area of the North Atlantic called the Hatteras Abyssal Plain. We still don't know if the Russians plan to retrieve their sub. Number 5. USS Scorpion. The USS Scorpion was a skipjack-class attack scud that sank under mysterious circumstances in the North Atlantic in 1968. After not returning home to Virginia, the vessel was eventually located by a team several months later. This gives it the dubious honor of being one of only 2 nuclear submarines lost at sea by the Americans. What was the other one? Well, we'll talk about that one soon enough. Also referred to as SSN 589, the Scorpion was 251 feet long with a 31-foot beam. It was powered by an S-5W nuclear reactor and carried Mark 45 or Aster nuclear torpedoes. So how come it wound up thousands of feet down in the ocean? To this day, people aren't sure. A blast resulting from an accidental buildup of hydrogen is thought to be the primary culprit. It may also have been that the Soviets attacked the Scorpion. The sub was there to engage the enemy, after all. Another theory states a torpedo may have blown up while still inside the vessel. Or on a similar note, could the Scorpion have launched a torpedo inadvertently and struck itself? Was a faulty trash disposal unit to blame, allowing water to flood the compartments? All kinds of explanations spring up in the wake of a tragedy like this. 99 souls were reportedly lost. Speaking of unexplained, the Scorpion tragedy received added attention because it took place in the same year as 3 other submarines that went missing. Should we continue to use nuclear power, or is it too risky? Is there a better alternative? Share your ideas in the comments. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 4. K-8. Lying 15,000 feet down in the Bay of Biscay, Europe, is the Soviet submarine K-8. It's an authentic part of Russian military history, though not exactly in a good way. The K-8 was one of the first Soviet subs known as the November class. These vessels were powerful but made a lot of noise, which ultimately limited how they could be used in combat. The sub began operation in 1960 and it carried smaller nuclear warheads intended to be fired at enemy transport convoys. The K-8 was bearing 4 such torpedoes when it was cruising in the Bay of Biscay as part of a huge Soviet war game known as Okean 70. At 352 feet long, 26 feet wide, and with an underwater speed of 30 knots, it made a powerful addition to the fleet, even if you could hear it coming from a distance. What happened? A surprising amount of stuff involving submarines involves accidents, especially with a relatively untested type of craft. The November class was an early Russian nuclear attack sub, so not something you were aboard for the fun of it. It reportedly suffered a radiation-based accident not long after taking to the water in the 60s, and an even worse situation was waiting for the following decade. Not just 1 but 2 fires on board resulted in an evacuation. Yet this wasn't straightforward. 8 crewmen sadly died, and the Russians couldn't just leave a big nuclear submarine to sink. As with the K-219 we mentioned earlier, it took an incredible 3 days to try and rescue the K-8. Its reactors were closed down, and it had no power, so the Navy needed to go in there and grab it. Tragically, the weather was not on their side, making the mission too challenging. Worst of all, there were dozens of men aboard when the vessel finally went down. Reports vary in terms of numbers, but it's believed around 50 men lost their lives on the ship. The warheads sank along with them, as the team could not reach them in time. Thankfully, 73 men survived. Number 3. K-278 Komsomolets. The K-278 Komsomolets was a Soviet attack sub that sank in the Barents Sea, part of the Arctic Ocean, back in 1989. Measuring 385 feet long and 35 feet wide, it had a top speed of 30 knots while submerged. How did it end its days 5,512 feet below the surface? The answer is another example of just how dangerous it can be to pilot a nuclear submarine at sea. A fire was triggered when air hoses came loose and acted almost as deadly weapons, damaging a fuel section and creating a short circuit. The sub went into emergency mode with reactors shutting down. If the crew weren't careful, they'd sink. Drastic action needed to be taken, so ballast tanks were ditched, enabling the ship to float to the surface. The blaze still needed to be tackled. 9 men died during the catastrophe. After a matter of hours, it became clear the cause was lost. Most of the crew had abandoned the ship and were at the mercy of the freezing water. Things were so dangerous that the 4 men who stayed on board with the captain had to get out of the sub using an escape capsule. Sadly, only 1 man made it to the surface alive. As for the rest of the crew, 30 died and 27 survived. Number 2. USS Thresher. Earlier we talked about the tragedy of the USS Scorpion in 1968. That situation altered the U.S. Navy's practices concerning American nuclear subs. But there was another case that led to the changes as well. It happened 5 years later aboard the USS Thresher. The sub sank in the Atlantic Ocean near Cape Cod while in the middle of a training exercise. The first of the Thresher class was 279 feet long and 32 feet wide. It reportedly had a maximum speed of 33 knots. Often you'll see two descriptions of a submarine's speed, one for above the surface and the other for below. Subs move faster under the water, which obviously makes sense. However, the thing about nuclear subs is they don't have to rise to the surface unless something is wrong. The Thresher possessed a teardrop-shaped hole to aid momentum down in the depths. After being made aware that the sub was in trouble during the training exercise, authorities lost contact with the Thresher. They later discovered 6 separate pieces of the sub. 129 men aboard lost their lives, with 17 of those being outside contractors. The base picked up the sound of rushing air after the vessel reported issues, but aside from that, it wasn't clear why the ship went down the way it did. A classified investigation was carried out, but the public didn't get a fuller picture until 2020 when legal action was taken to make the Navy release the documents. The services report stated that a single loose pipe was behind the sinking. The files also revealed a sequence of problems. These included sloppy welding and an alleged lack of thorough training for the men. The construction of the sub was apparently undertaken with haste, which it's believed relates to Soviet military developments and a desire to beat them in the arms race. Number 1. Kursk. Probably the most well-known nuclear submarine in the world right now is the Kursk. As well as making headlines back in 2000, it's also been the subject of major motion pictures. The Kursk measured 505 feet long and 60 feet wide. The Russian Oscar II class sub sank approximately 350 feet in the Barents Sea following an onboard explosion. 118 crew members died, while 23 survived longer than the others. What happened? It's widely reported that a torpedo leaked a volatile propellant inside the sub, resulting in the disaster. Even more tragically, it took Russian authorities far too long to reach the craft, with unnecessary delays and an unwillingness to bring in other nations in order to help with the rescue. The situation is regarded as a shocking case of mismanagement on behalf of the Kremlin. However, those in charge have maintained that there was more to the sinking than met the eye, and that a collision with an enemy sub led to the tragedy. If you were stationed on a nuclear sub, who would you want to be there with you? Tell me who and why in the comments. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our great videos, and we'll see you again soon for another amazing video right here on American Eye.